I really didn't pay that careful attention to building and developing my network. And I think that that's an extremely important piece. And I think that when I was younger, I used to think about network building as though it wasn't authentic because it felt like you were using people. It felt like you were trying to figure out who's most valuable for me. And I didn't like attributing value of individuals to what they could do for me. But what I realized is it turns out none of us are really that great all by ourselves. And so it's not about figuring out who can do what for me. It's really about recognizing that I'm better with other people in my network, and I've learned to sort of shift that focus a bit and realize the value of building a network, regardless of what I think you can do for me. Having those relationships and building those connections is extremely important.
Hey everyone, this is Devin Miller here with another episode of The Inventive Journey. I'm your host, Devin Miller, a serial entrepreneur that's grown several startups into 7- and 8-figure businesses, as well as the founder and CEO of Miller IP Law, where he helps startups and small businesses with their patents and trademarks. If you ever need help with yours, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat. We're always here to help. Now, today we've got another great guest on the podcast, Bryon Bhagwandin. And Bryon grew up in the Midwest in Indiana and got a bachelor's and master's degrees in physics. Started working for Eli Lilly in their drug department. Decided to try and combine drug development and physics, and so pursued a PhD in pharmaceutical science, and then went to work for a medical company to help them on their compliance side, and then switched over into the startup world with a company and was VP of product development. Worked for another startup in Texas for a period of time, and then moved to Colorado with a startup went to a startup conference to help solve medical problems. This led to the startup that he's doing today that I'll talk a little bit more about, and maybe in a little bit about some of the COVID issues that's popped up with the startup and then dealing with that. So with that much as an introduction, welcome on the podcast, Bryon.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Absolutely. So I gave the 30-second condensed version of a much longer journey, but maybe unpacking that just a bit. So going back a bit back in time, tell us how your journey kind of got started in Indiana.
Okay. So as you said, I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in physics. And for those who are in your audience who are Hoosiers, I have a degree from each of the two rival universities, one from Indiana University and one from Purdue. So I'm splitting my time there. And then as you said, I went to work, oddly enough, for Eli Lilly as a central nervous system physiologist. Learned some things about drug development, learned some things about central nervous system, about rats and animal models and animal husbandry. But I was a bit of a fish out of water, having been used to sitting down with a calculator and a pencil and an eraser with a piece of graph paper and figuring out what the answer to the problem was. In physics, it was very different when I transitioned to pharmaceutical discovery. So trying to put those two things together, the physics, the physiology. I applied to a biomedical engineering program at the University of Washington, was accepted, and really my research focuses on biomedical sensing and medical instrumentation. So that was the education part of the career.
Now, just one kind of question on that. So you go and you say, okay, working in the drug department, going to love to kind of combine drug development and physics, and so you go into the pharmaceutical science. Now, was there kind of a tipping point or period where you said, okay, I'd like to go back and get a PhD, it's going to help further my career, or it's going to help to combine, or I feel like it's, I don't have experience in this area? Kind of what was the trigger or the aha moment or the genesis for saying, hey, I'd like to go back and get the PhD?
Great question, Devin. I think a big part of it was well, there were a couple of factors that led to that decision. One was um, I like to have a certain amount of expertise in whatever it is that I do. I am a bit of a perfectionist and want to be the best at whatever it is that I do. And I knew that coming into drug discovery with a degree in physics put me in a minority category, and most of the people I worked with had a decade of education in biology and physiology and other life science studies that for me to catch up was going to be extremely difficult. So I sort of had that, in the back of my mind, but I didn't want that to limit me. But I remember a set of experiments I was doing with my supervisor was an extremely senior individual in the company, and he carried a lot of clout, which is why he could hire a physics student to work in a physiology department. And at that point, I still hadn't had a 100 level biology class in college. So, but we were doing these experiments on, it was a stroke model with rats, and a bit of a funny story, but they were going along swimmingly. And then one day it just stopped. We could not reproduce the results we were getting. The whole study was in jeopardy and we weren't sure what was going on. And after I had exhausted my analysis, my sort of repeating the studies, doing what I could, I went to my supervisor and I said, I don't know what to do. I need somebody who has greater expertise than I do in this field. And we had a long conversation, and eventually he said to me, rats are nocturnal. And maybe if you tried doing the experiments with the lights out, we'd get better results. And I thought to myself, if that's the best you can come up with, I think I might be in the wrong field here. And just to complete the story, it's a little funny. It turns out that there was construction going on across the street, and they were putting in a high-rise building, and they were driving iron I-beams into the ground with an impact hammer, and it was sending low amplitude, high frequency ripples through the ground, and it was actually keeping the rats awake all day long while they were supposed to be sleeping. So they were in fact sleep deprived. It was in fact related to the fact that rats are nocturnal, but it's a bit of a funny story that just shows you how much experience really matters, even as much as expertise does in terms of academic study. So then I went off to the University of Washington, looking at sensors, looking at hardware, trying to combine that with all the things I'd learned about physiology and multivariate systems, which is a fancy way of saying the body, which has a lot of variables and things that you can't control, and trying to figure out how I could apply my experience and expertise to medical problems.
Nice. No, and that's an interesting story, and it's always kind of interesting the variables that you maybe can't account for or wouldn't have thought of that can impact both the study as well as the course that you take. So now you go and get the PhD. You're coming back out of school. You say, okay, I'd like to have that experience, have that background, or take in a bit of different direction. And then I think you mentioned you came out of school and started working for a medical company, helping them on the compliance side. Is that right?
Yeah, I started working for a company in Seattle, Washington. It was a product development company that had a strong presence in the consumer product world and in the back-end software, enterprise software. And then they also did some one-off work for various large companies in the area. Hewlett Packard and Microsoft and Apple were their clients. And it was sort of overflow work from them. But they really wanted to get into the founder of that company wanted to get into the medical device business. And I was the first biomedical engineer that he hired. and we had to set up a compliant development process before we could really get into the business and start doing medical device development. And so I was integral in setting that process up and making sure that we were compliant both for the FDA and also for medical CE marking with Europe. So that sort of broadened my experience, and then I spent a lot of time doing development, and that was I can't speak enough of highly enough of that experience, because for one, an average project that we would get would come through, it might take 3 months. And so I saw so many different medical device development works. I mean, I think the longest project I worked on was 9 to 12 months, but in the course of a number of years, I saw more projects than most people will see in that short a period of time. So that was a terrific experience. But in addition to that, medical device development, it involves sort of multidisciplinary cross-functional teams, mechanical engineering, use engineering, electrical engineering, optics, and then there's all the wet chemistry that goes with it and the biology. And I worked with some terrific people. I mean, they were recruiting software engineers out of Microsoft, and they were recruiting electrical engineers out of Fluke, the test and measurement company, and they were getting mechanical engineers out of Boeing. So I just worked around some really great people, and I just really cherish those days and those experiences.
Now, no, and I think that sounds like a lot of, a great experience and a lot of opportunities. And I think, some of the things that we chatted about a bit was, throughout that journey. So you went and worked with that compliance side, had some great experiences. You also kind of started to dip your toe into the startup world. And so you got into first working for a company in doing the product development, or VP of product development. Then you moved to Texas for a period of time, worked for another startup. Before moving back to Colorado. Is that right?
Yeah, that's a fair mapping of the journey. So Indiana to Seattle, Seattle to Austin, Texas, and Texas north to Colorado. So now always really in the startup world.
So now as you're doing that, first of all, what kind of directed you into the startup world? Was it just happenstance? It was a fun opportunity. You always wanted to work for a startup. Somebody approached you and made you the proverbial offer you couldn't refuse, or kind of how did you get started in those startups?
That's a great question. It's funny, one of the, and I'll just start with this anecdote, because I did not grow up in an entrepreneurial environment. Indiana, when I was in high school in the 70s and 80s, was a pretty blue collar kind of town, and I remember when I moved to Seattle in the 90s, I was sitting in a restaurant with my wife, and the table beside us, the person, one of the individuals in the table beside us, had lost their job, and the person that they were having dinner with was counseling them that maybe they should put out a shingle and they should just start a business. And this struck my wife and I both, and we talked about it all the way home. It's just like, that is not advice that somebody in Indiana would give you. It wasn't one of the sort of options in the menu, is start a company. Why don't you just start a company? Well, that's because that was the spirit in Seattle. And so I got exposed to a lot of that. Just in the environment, there were a lot of people that I came to know who were in the startup world, but also a lot of the most interesting projects that came through the product development company that I was working for were the startup companies. They were really doing things that had never been done before. I mean, when Hewlett Packard comes to you and says, we're making another printer, and this is overflow work for us, and we'd like you guys to sort of do the development, take it through its paces, and make sure it gets released on time. It will pay the bills. But when somebody else comes and says, we've got a new way of determining, of setting, retarding aging in people. And we just want to build a sensor that looks at this particular biomarker and see if we can identify where we've gone wrong, and how we can push back the aging process. And nobody's ever done it. You get nothing to start with, and you put an engineering team together. You think about the problem. You have to come up to speed extremely rapidly, and then you have to execute. And it was an exhilarating and exciting time to work on those startup problems. And that's really what I think sparked my curiosity, my interest. It was the kind of thing where you rise and fall by your own merits, but also, there was a sense of being able to celebrate even your failures, right? Because there is something about embracing the idea that I've tried something and it didn't work. And now I've learned from it, and I'm not going to let that go, because that's going to make me better in the future. And, oftentimes that's not something that a larger company will embrace, and let happen.
No, I think it's definitely some good points, and makes sense kind of what caused the move over to the kind of the startup world. So now as we kind of jump a bit or again forward, so we talked a little bit about, so you moved around to Texas and then back to Colorado. And I think one of the things is you moving back to Colorado, you got involved with kind of a startup conference or something of that nature, and that kind of set you on the trajectory to where you're at today with the current business. But how did that get started, or kind of what was that part of the journey?
Well, it turns out, as I mentioned earlier, there was a lot of startup companies that came through the product development group that I was working with, and one of them came back about 2 or 3 years later and said, "You did an outstanding job of prototyping for us, and we even helped them write some of their technical business plan." And that individual, who was the CEO, came and asked if I would be willing to sort of pull some technology out of the Naval Research Labs. He had an opportunity, and so he invited me to do that. And so my first startup was really working in Seattle in sort of in stealth mode. He was in Austin, Texas. We took that company to the point where we built some prototypes. We sold our initial prototypes to the government. They were very happy with it, because it had come out of the Naval Research Labs, and we translated it from their research to a practical product, sold that company. And then there was another company in Austin that heard about this, and they came recruiting and said, "Hey, do you have any recommendations for somebody who might lead our product development? We like what you did there." And they also had been a prior client of the company in Seattle. And so I then moved to Austin as a consequence of that, helped them with that company. Unfortunately, it did not, it was not a breakthrough unicorn, as they say, and stayed with that company until we had to close the doors, and then moved to Colorado because of personal issues that were going on in my life that afforded us that opportunity. And there was this conference, and it's a very unique thing, Devin, here in Denver. It was called 10-10-10. It's now X Genesis, but 10-10-10 stands for 10 CEOs, 10 wicked problems, and 10 days. And the organization was founded by a serial entrepreneur who wanted to see the entrepreneurial spirit applied to really difficult problems that we face. He would pick a theme, whether it was health or climate or finance. He would pick a theme. His team would go out and put together a dossier of a problem, 10 problems actually, and they put a dossier together for each one of them. Consider it a sort of like an overview due diligence of the problem, what's been tried, what are the market-based solutions, what are the problems that you potentially run into. And those dossiers were then presented to each of these 10 potential CEOs, and then there's an unusual community in Denver, and I think it's because so much of the population is a transplant, and so everybody knows. If you're new to Denver, they know what that feels like because they were new to Denver at one point as well. And so when I went through the program, there were probably 160 volunteers who gave up 10 days of their time. And some of them, were able to get time off from work. Some of them took their vacation time to do it. Some of them, it was part of their work. We had attorneys there. We had experienced business leaders. We had, I met the head of medical innovation from Kaiser Permanente was there. I met the senior health policy advisor from the last two governorships.
Now, maybe just to dive in, just to keep the journey moving forward. So now with that all in mind, kind of where does that put you today, or kind of where you are currently at?
Well, that's really where this company came from. So we came together for 10 days. They presented these problems, and the problem that was presented, I participated as one of the CEOs, and they built a team around me to spend 10 days looking at that problem and come up with a market-based solution. And Recalibrate Solutions, which is the company that I started back in 2018, was really born out of that process. And so, and some of those people that I met are still involved with the company, either as advisors or my co-founder was the subject matter expert for this particular problem. So, and it's what we're doing is a 5-minute saliva cortisol sensor to monitor the health of the stress response system in kids. And so that's kind of it in a nutshell, but that's where that company came from. It's an extraordinary program. I spoke to another group about it, and they said we should make a TV show out of that. I mean, that's and it was a pretty extraordinary thing that we did. So that was neat.
Now, where is that business today? Is it growing, selling products, pre-launch? Kind of, will give the audience an idea of kind of where's the business at today?
So we have developed the test, and we have not been able to get regulatory. I shouldn't phrase it that way. We haven't yet submitted for regulatory clearance. So we are in the process of a funding round to actually to collect the data we need for our regulatory submission. And COVID sort of threw a wrench into our plans and our timelines, but we're still here and still working. So that's kind of where we are.
No, and I definitely get, I mean, if you're working with people in saliva and having to be much up close and personal and kind of gathering that, COVID probably makes it a bit difficult to get a lot of volunteers or people to do that, or the state or the municipalities will even let you do that. So now as we're coming out of COVID, I guess the first question is kind of how did you stay alive, or how did you navigate that?
Great question. Of course, we were just making it up as we go. I mean, I launched a funding campaign in the end of February 2020, and in March everything shut down, and so everybody took their money and said, "I'm sorry, we can't make any new investments. We're saving our money to see what happens with this. We want to make sure our current portfolio survives." So we had originally, our plan was to outsource some of this development. I have contacts with the people who did the original saliva-based HIV test, and they did some of this development for us initially, and we were going to continue on with them. But COVID caused us to actually have to do a technology transfer from their development efforts into our labs. We quickly scrambled and signed a facilities use agreement with one of the local universities. We found we added to our research team. We added an assay development chemist. brought all of that technology in-house and started doing development over the last 2 years. But one of the things, again, going back to what you said, collecting saliva samples was difficult, and during a respiratory pandemic. And so we developed an artificial saliva that mimicked the saliva that we know about, and that was just a research effort. There were some things that you can get off the shelf, and we started there and modified, and so we started continuing our research with an artificial saliva, and now as things are easing up on the COVID side, we're starting to collect saliva samples again, and making sure that and confirming that what we've developed up to this point with artificial saliva is still valid.
Well, it sounds like it was a great way to kind of keep the company moving forward, continue to do the research and development, and find out find a way to continue to keep the company moving upwards. So, well, with that, now as we kind of reach the future, the current present point of your journey, it's always a great time to transition to the two questions I always ask at the end of each journey. So the first question I always ask is, along your journey, what was the worst business decision you ever made? What did you learn from it?
That's an interesting question, and I've thought about that a little bit as I've reflected on my own journey and thought about this podcast coming up. And I would say that it has to do with not making assumptions about the people who work for you. I try to run an organization and manage in a very transparent way, and I try to empower people, and I try to encourage people to contribute to whatever it is that we're doing, whether it's development effort or whether it's business development or product development, whatever it is, that they have a say and they have a voice. In doing that, I frequently will give people the benefit of the doubt, and I will make assumptions about how they've taken care of something or how they've handled part of their responsibility. And I'll tell you what happened in this particular situation. I was working in product development. I had a client that we were developing a product for, and we were due to do a design review with them and show them how the product was working. And we were going to something like order parts for 6 and make 5, bring them in, and turn it all on and let the client watch their product at work. And we got into the lab, and we started. We were going to build these devices up, and I turned to the mechanical engineer and who had done all the design work, and I said, "Where are the fasteners?" And he said, I wasn't responsible for fasteners. And as a consequence, we were set back pretty significantly by in our schedule, because I assumed that he would take care of everything that was in the mechanical engineering bucket. And that included, during integration, that you would have all the fasteners and the PEMs and the nuts and the bolts and the rivets that we needed. And he didn't. He saw his work as purely design. Very good designer, but needless to say, poor at the details as it related to integration and moving through that. So I have since learned to not to make those kinds of assumptions, to be respectful, to still empower people, but to make sure that I'm not just that I'm inspecting as well as expecting. And
I think that and it's an easy mistake to make. I think that when you're doing things, sometimes you're always gauging how much rope to give, how much training, how much autonomy, and how much things you can figure out. And sometimes you have to let people have a bit of rope, figure things out, and you don't want to micromanage. But by the same point, if you if you give them that rope and you don't give them, it can be your fault. You don't give them enough guidance. You don't give them enough instruction, or can they be their fault where they just kind of overlook things or don't really pay attention to the details? But it's all the same. It's always that balancing act of, how much or autonomy to give them, how much instructions and that. And I think that's always something that you learn as you continue to go along in a business.
Yep.
Second question I always ask is, if you're talking now to someone that's just getting into a startup or a small business, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give them?
I think that this is a piece of advice I would give people because of the mistake I made. And I think that we live in a culture that really promotes and advocates independence. And so people really tend to isolate without even trying. And when it came time for me to launch my own business and raise money and build teams, et cetera, I found my network was somewhat lacking. And it turns out that I really didn't pay that careful attention to building and developing my network. And I think that that's an extremely important piece. And I think that when I was younger, I used to think about network building as though it wasn't authentic, because it felt like you were using people. It felt like you were trying to figure out who's most valuable for me. And I didn't like attributing value of individuals to what they could do for me. But what I realized is it turns out none of us are really that great all by ourselves. And so it's not about figuring out who can do what for me. It's really about recognizing that I'm better with other people in my network. And I've learned to sort of shift that focus a bit and realize the value of building a network, regardless of what I think you can do for me. Having those relationships and building those connections is extremely important.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And I mean, I think that network building is hard because sometimes, everybody's been on the end where you go to the networking events or you're somewhere and you can just tell that all they're trying to do is make a connection to see if you'll give them some money or you'll purchase their product, and they're really not in there to do anything. And so it can come across as, hey, network building isn't a good idea, or, it becomes across as you're just trying to ask some people for that, and it's really not beneficial to everybody. But I think if you can actually figure out, no, hey, let's build a network, let's actually add value to each other, or just add value to them, and someday maybe they'll add value back, and you can just establish actual connections and continue to support each other. I think that's where a lot of network building comes in and can make a great impact, but you have to do it under the right guys, and I think that's a great takeaway.
Yeah.
As we wrap up, if people want to reach out to you, they want to be a customer, they want to be a client, they want to be an employee, they want to be an investor, they want to be your next best friend, any or all of the above, what's the best way to reach out to you, contact you, find out more?
I think probably through my LinkedIn profile, which I hope you'll include in the show notes, or through the website at recalibratesolutions.com is another good way to find out what we're doing. And then you can find my LinkedIn profile and connect with me through the website also.
Awesome. Well, I definitely encourage people to connect up with LinkedIn or through the website, reach out to you, support you, and maybe even make a new best friend. So, well, with that, as we wrap up, thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's been it's been a pleasure. Now, for all of you that are listeners, if you have your own journey to tell, you'd like to be guests on the podcast, we'd love to have you. Just go to inventiveguest.com, apply to be on the show. A couple more things as listeners, make sure you click share, subscribe, leave us a review, because we want to make sure that everyone finds out about all these awesome episodes. Last but not least, if you ever need help with your patents, your trademarks, or anything else with your startup or your small business, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat. Well, thank you again, Bryon, for coming on the podcast, and wish the next leg of your journey even better than the last.
Thank you, Devin. I appreciate it. I hope you have a great day.